would like to introduce the sixth and last session of the day, focusing on emerging consumer trends in China. So today we are going to range from the very broad assessments of the overall relation with China until the in-depth specific evaluation of what do we see from a very consumer-oriented perspective. So to this end, I would like to invite to the floor once again, unfortunately, only virtually, Sadie Bargeron, brand consultant from Jing Daily. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. I'm really apologetic that I can't be there in person, but I thank you everyone for listening today. And yeah, so I've worked at Jing Daily for 5 years now as brand editor, and my main focus has been the luxury industry, but that's also crossed into various other industries. So I'm sure there's something interesting for everyone in this room. But I've mainly focused on Chinese Gen Z. So today I thought it might be interesting to look into the Gen Z consumer behaviors that are really shaping not just luxury, but also fashion, art, culture, and these different areas that are really coming together in consumption patterns in China among youth culture. But also it's because we're launching this week an amazing report on Gen Z behaviors in China at Jing Daily. So I don't know if everyone here is familiar with Jing Daily, but we're a platform that discusses the business of luxury in China. And we mainly focus on brand strategy and earnings reports, business developments in the Chinese market. And my focus has been largely Chinese Gen Z. So today I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So I thought we would focus on Chinese Gen Z. Obviously, China is the second largest luxury consumer in the world, the second largest luxury market. And Chinese Gen Z makes up 15% of China's population. So I think navigating the complexities of Chinese Gen Z behaviors is really crucial for business in luxury, but also other industries. So according to Oliver Wyman data, Chinese Gen Z and millennials account for 70% of luxury global spending, which is absolutely huge. And I think it's a really interesting demographic in China because there are just so many ways that this cohort is breaking conventions, particularly in the tier one cities. Unlike their predecessors, Gen Z in China, they grew up with leading Western designer stores already established in the market. They were the first digital natives. Some of them really grew up when there was this big outbound tourism boom in China. So they're a distinctly globalized cohort. And among youth, especially in China, a lot of them are using VPNs and having access to Western internet. So it's really a lot more homogenized than youth culture and Chinese consumption patterns used to be in terms of globally. And even they're breaking conventions a lot in different ways, like the marriage rates are at historic lows and their approach to work and career paths is a lot more diverse. So they're embracing a lot more unconventional income, especially with apps like Shanyu. It's spelled Xianyu. It's become this kind of side hustle. It's the Chinese Depop, which is a secondhand resale app, but it's also become this hub of like various hustle culture, like weird jobs that people are becoming like boyfriends for a day, or they're doing random odd jobs. And I feel like there's this real diversity of how young people in China are getting their incomes, and even the creative industries have become a lot more open in terms of considering that as a career path. So I think in general, Gen Z consumption in China is really shapen by this weakened traditional support structures. But also there's an intensified urban pressure at the same time. And I think all of these different factors really come into the consumption patterns that businesses and brands and various companies need to consider in terms of delivering this sense of belonging, community, and meeting the emotional needs also of Chinese Gen Z. So I think I'd love to now go on to the first point and really look into how we're defining. Could I take it to the next, sorry, the next slide? So as part of our report, we looked into the various style subcultures that are online. So if you go on Xiaohongshu or Douyin, which is Red Note, is the first one that I mentioned, and it's this Chinese Instagram, and it's basically this visual diary of all these various like style subcultures. So for me, as I work in fashion mainly, it's a great way to really categorize what trends are coming out of China, but also the pace at which Chinese Gen Z consumers are picking up different trends and how community led they are in their mindset. I think the amount of the engagement is just so high for these various phrases that categorize each styles. And I think, yeah, so we did a survey as part of the report that I've just finished with Jing Daily, and we had some really interesting points. So one of the highest categories of spend among Chinese Gen Z is clothing, and that's followed by footwear and leather goods. So fashion is still a really high area of consumption. And then also in general, it feels like they're spending a lot more than they're saving. So again, they're defying conventions compared to their parents. A lot of the Gen Z that we spoke to in Shanghai and Beijing, they were saying that they're a lot more open to spending. They're not really thinking so much about the future. I think it really goes along with these falling marriage rates. So people are kind of open to living a more ungeneric lifestyle structure, really. And there's a lot more self-love. Even when we look at the Chinese Valentine's Day, Qishi, there's a lot more focus on self-love. And even in the luxury brand campaigns that we're seeing, there's a lot more focus on that and like the pet culture and gifting to pets. And I think these are really new developments in the Chinese market that perhaps weren't so open to discuss among brands and companies. And I think people are starting to realize that there's so much diversity within China. And so I think, yeah, a lot of these platforms, the social media platforms, have really amplified niche aesthetics in terms of fashion. So we're seeing a lot of self-expression in terms of kawaii maximalism and the Y2K resurgence. And there's also this reverting back to old technology and this nostalgia for the old tech, because China's obviously progressing so quickly and amazingly in terms of technology. But then at the same time, there's this real urge to reuse digital cameras. Like a lot of the Gen Alpha and Gen Z in China are using digital cameras rather than the latest phones, and they're wanting to have flip phones. And there's this real nostalgia for old technology. But one of the main factors that's really defining Chinese Gen Z, obviously, when I talk about Chinese Gen Z, it's really hard to generalize because it's a massive, huge population in China. And I'm mainly discussing tier one cities when I'm discussing Chinese Gen Z, as the survey that we did was among Beijing and Shanghai. But I do also have insights into the wider population of China in other reports that we've done. But the main focus for these tier one city Chinese Gen Zers is travel. So they're spending a lot of more money on vacations and wellness experiences rather than wanting to save to buy houses. So I'm sure that's a whole other conversation, but there's a real property crisis going on in China as these new conventions are kind of set in pace. And I think despite being the most connected generation in China's history, the digital saturation has really pushed Gen Z offline. So that links into this urge to travel and have experiences rather than, and also this desire for old technology. I think there's a real kind of paradox going on where they want to be really online and they want to share their offline experiences, but then they also want to escape it all. So yeah, I think through 2025, we've seen a lot of brand activations and mindful consumption patterns and trends happening in terms of Chinese Gen Z. So I think we can go on to the next slide now. Thank you. So I thought we would talk, I'm not sure how many people in the room are working in fashion, but a lot of these facts that I'm talking about can be placed into other industries as well, because it's just a way of considering how Chinese consumers interact with product and their psychologically how they're becoming quite a community oriented, fan focused culture. So I think compared to any other market that I analyze in China, it's very community oriented and there's a lot more copying going on, and they're very much more open to labeling exactly the communities and the kind of cultish brands that they're part of. So it can really make a brand shoot off in the market because of how big the fan culture is among netizens in China. And so I thought I'd look into two really big style subcultures that have been going on in 2025. And the first one that I'd like to discuss is kawaii culture. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Labubus, and this was obviously really big in China before anywhere else, because Pop Mart is a Chinese corporation, of course, but also I think it really struck a chord with this Chinese urge for like familiarity and comfort and nostalgia, and yeah, this childlike sensibility that is really going on among Gen Z. And I think emotion is really strongly linked to what is landing well in China at the moment. And we've seen a resurgence of Gyaru fashion, which is a 1980s Japanese style subculture that really took off through the 90s and into the 2000s. And it was a bold subculture that's all about really deep tans, lightened bleached hair, and really dramatic makeup. And it was a way for young women in Japan and China and East Asia to push back against traditional beauty expectations and express this really unapologetic identity. And I feel like the Chinese Gen Z in 2025 are really having this, they can resonate with that now because they're really defying conventions. They're feeling like they can express themselves a lot more freely. I mean, if you visit Chengdu and Shanghai, these cities are really have a massive queer culture and it's very open-minded. And I think China, the young people in China are a lot of them are very self-expressive, and that's why Gyaru fashion has really taken off and come back. And there's this really a big embrace of colorful self-expression and vibrance. And yeah, I think it really marks this consumer psychology shift, where there's, I think, more muted tones are a lot calmer, whereas there's now this like yearning for bursts of endorphins and humor and escapism. And I think brands shouldn't take themselves seriously. They should take themselves seriously, but in the Chinese market, there is this tongue-in-cheek humor that lands so well among the younger generation in particular. But I think that is something that also leans into the older generations, Gen X, the baby boomers. I think particularly in China, humor sells particularly well. And I think that is here to stay. And I think that's why the Labubu boom really took off in the market, and this maximalist charm culture of wearing teddy bears on your handbags. And this really links into Lulicore, which is another style subculture that has been huge this year in China. There's like hundreds of millions of posts on Xiaohongshu referencing Lulicore. And it's interesting because in the West, I think if a trend is taking off to that extent, everyone calls it a bit tired and no one wants to be kind of tagging the trend anymore, or they'll get a bit bored of it. But I think in China, these trends really do have longevity, because once people have a definition of them, they can really build into this. They feel like they can carve an identity, and it's dressing up into a character. And so this Lulicore aesthetic is basically, it's rooted in a French dessert, cannelé. So it's basically a dessert inspired color palette. So it's all like creams, and I think you can see in this image, if you can see, there's like the browns, yellows, blues, and it's pistachio greens, and it's all about combining comfort and sweetness and this touch of like old world luxury at the same time. Miu Miu made this aesthetic in China especially popular, like this wealthy Jerez look is very popular at the moment in China, and I think there's this old money mix with this sweetness, and that really projects what is really happening among Chinese Gen Z at the moment. They want a touch of familiarity and comfort in what you're offering, but they also appreciate this old world luxury and these heritage stories and established names. And yeah, I think these sugary shades really provide a visual solace for consumers instead of all these fast fashion or brand logos. I think that it seems like colors are really coming to represent a lot of these style subcultures. So that's an interesting evolution in terms of consumer trends. I think we can go on to the next slide now. This is another look into kawaii. So this is what I've already kind of discussed, but this is just the Hello Kitty TBH pop-up that was in Shanghai on the left. Is just a way that a brand has really tapped into this kawaii subculture, because that went viral on Xiaohongshu. And yeah, this is kind of linked to what I was just saying. So I think we can go on to the next slide. The next point that I wanted to talk about is how big community is among Chinese Gen Z and fan culture. They seem quite obvious things to talk about in Gen Z, in terms of Gen Z consumer behaviors on a global scale. But I think in China, consumers are so fiercely community led in their interests. So they're looking to their hobbies. They don't just have hobbies, they have whole worlds that are stretched around these hobbies. So I think even we're seeing that in a lot of the retail spaces that are popping up around China. They are third spaces. They're not just a nicely designed interior retail store. They're actually becoming cafes. There's even hubs where families can hang out and eat. And I think a lot of the time, especially in cycling and running culture in China among young people, the whole thing is on Chinese social media apps, you have hashtags that have racked up hundreds of millions of views that are all about what people are wearing while they're cycling. And also, like, even more so than in the West, I think in the UK and the US, there are a lot of memes that are talking about how much money you spend on your outfit. But in China, it's like a whole other level of like how many brands, there's so many cycling brands. I mean, a lot of the Western brands are doing quite well. Like Rafa has just opened a clubhouse in Shanghai that's offering a cycling cafe and a retail space, and people go and hang out there on the weekends and they do rides. And they've done quite a few different activations and created their own club that people are a part of. And yeah, I think quite a few different brands are taking this route to connect with Chinese consumers, of hosting their own rides. And yeah, I think the Descent is another sports brand that just opened a flagship in Beijing, and it's literally insane. Everyone should Google it. It's so huge. But it's also just really understanding this third space mentality. So there's even a family room where you can go with kids and they can experience different parts of the brand. There's a cafe there's like a whole kids zone. And it's just, I think the third space mindset that is going on in key cities like New York, London, Paris, in China, it's like another level of how well they're catering to these needs. And combining performance with interiors and the coffee culture, and tapping into like the food. There's a lot of amazing food trends going on in China, and I think brands that really leverage the appeal of the communities around food, cafes, like merging music and these sports and just looking into thinking about a whole world behind these brands is really important when connecting to young people in China. I think we're obviously seeing F1 is gaining even more popularity. I think there are 100 million F1 fans in China now, and yeah, Puma partnered with the Ferrari F1 team to release the F1 Chinese Grand Prix exclusive collection, and that really took off among Gen Z. And just having that localized aspect is such a winning factor because these young people in China are so proud of made in China. And I think what used to be kind of affiliated, not necessarily with as positive as it is now, there's this whole renewed national pride going on in China that is just so amazing. And I think you're seeing it with Adidas have been viral in the West recently, and all this year really, with their tang suit style track jackets. So they're localizing their designs according to what young people would want in China. And because Chinese young people want to wear something Chinese, but they also love Adidas. So it's cool to be merging these different touch points. And I think like the NBA always do such an amazing job at getting their players to tour China and host activations for young people. So they'll do like friendly basketball matches, they'll do meet and greets, they'll do even like youth clinics where they're teaching young basketball players in China, and different events that they draw like massive crowds. I think the fan culture in China is like one of the biggest, honestly, for NBA. It's like there were so many different players that toured China this year during the summer. And yeah, I think these media, there's a lot on social media, there's a lot of interaction and with fans now among the NBA players really getting involved on Chinese socials, and they're recognizing how huge the fan culture is in China and how that can sway your entire global impact. Yeah, there was, I mean, Stephen Curry, Aaron Gordon, James Harden, like LeBron, everyone was in China this year. So I think it's because it reopened the NBA. So I think, yeah, it's a really exciting time for sport and community and on a global scale. We can go on to the next slide. Honestly, with every single fashion week, every show you go to in Paris, there are screaming fans outside, and then every show that goes viral has usually got a K-pop star or a Chinese actress as well. A lot of the Chinese stars really do sway how well the shows perform. And yeah, I thought this was really interesting that according to II Media Research, 72.2% of Chinese Gen Z are spending money on their idols. So whether that's singles, concerts, albums, but also obviously endorsement, like the Labubu only took off really was because Blackpink's Lisa was seen wearing one on her Birkin. So that wasn't even a paid partnership. I think the amount of impact these K-pop stars have, and we always at Jing Daily, every single time it's Fashion Month, we look into which shows have got the most engagement and which ones are really showing strength in the Chinese market, and it's always related to K-pop stars. We always have exclusive data from Launch Metrics, and even seeing this, like South Korea contributed 14% of the whole of Milan. This was for Milan Fashion Weeks, the whole of the event. 14% is huge. So yeah, I think just it's really important to acknowledge, I think, K-pop's influence, but also to kind of use that to analyze the importance of using KOLs in the Chinese market. And influencer metrics are honestly just so crucial if you're present on these social platforms. But also, yeah, I think just they're really important, but risk assessing when you're using various different partners on a global scale. If you're using someone who is popular in China, the risk assessing is so crucial, because even this year we've had, I mean, I have an article coming out soon about all of the scandals that have happened this year among K-pop and Chinese celebrities as well, and it's really big. So yeah, I think working with China, risk assessing, the KOLs that you're working with has honestly got to be the most crucial part of your strategy. And at the moment, China is quite exciting because China's been opening up to have more music artists perform there. So for a while, it felt like there's been like a K-pop ban, but slowly we've had more K-pop stars performing in China. And even Kanye's just done he went to Shanghai and did a second gig, and Travis Scott performed in Macau, I think. Yeah, there's different, a lot of artists that were previously banned in China, and now I think the government's realizing the soft power of having music artists there. And obviously Hainan, they're trying to market that, the government's trying to market Hainan as a tourism hub. So they're using, I think Travis Scott is going to perform there. If he hasn't already, I need to check. But yeah, it seems like the government is loosening up on restrictions of concerts and censorship of music artists, which is a really interesting evolution. If we go on to the final slide before we go into a Q&A. So obviously in the report that I've just finished, we have a lot more information on Gen Z consumer behaviors, but to try and wrap it up quickly, as we don't have loads of time today, these are some key takeaways about young Chinese luxury consumers, but also general psychological consumer behaviors in China among young people. So I think, first of all, brands and businesses should really see subcultures as a strategic lens. They move really fast, which obviously can make investment risky, but I think they really offer a lot of value into understanding how these young people are thinking and how they're purchasing, what they're purchasing, the cultural nostalgia that's resonating among young people in China, looking into aesthetic preferences, color schemes, even with branding, if you want to think about what colors are resonating on a long-term basis in China. And instead of obviously chasing every style, subculture and design, I think brands should really weave the subcultures into their messaging, whether that's through experiential activations or influencer partnerships, collaborations across industries, or limited edition China exclusives. And then secondly, I think, yeah, offline experiences are real, like such a huge thing for China at the moment. They're creating identity spaces. Gen Zers are really kind of screen fatigued and they want offline experiences. And these offer identity markers. And they're made to be shared online, but I think this real urge for just the great outdoors and cycling clubs, 5Ks, fashion pop-ups, lifestyle events, all of these third spaces where young consumers can form friendships and create content and feel belonging. I think recognizing these communities is really important, and to engage different interests, and brands can really build real world connections with their consumers that way. And then third, I think fandom, obviously, I don't think I even need to tell you about how much fandom power drives consumption. China is really emerging as one of the most fan-driven markets, and it's largely down to the size, but I also think it's down to this crowd-led mindset and peer-to-peer recommendation that's really valuable in the market. I think obviously Chinese Gen Z are a lot more self-expressive, but there's still this need and want to kind of say someone says something's good, they want to try it. If there's like a hyped up food that everyone wants to try, everyone wants to go and everyone wants to take a photo to show that they were there. So I think even not necessarily investing in like these really expensive idol partnerships, brands should also tap into fandoms by collaborating creatively or exploring like niche interests and designing products that reward this active participation in these different communities rather than treating fans as passive consumers. And then fourth, I think emotional needs really drive loyalty. It's quite an obvious one, really, especially in the trend of having brands that are transparent, and making sure like this wellness, self-care and self kind of like expression is really present across all of your brand touch points. And yeah, I think the brands that are resonating the most are those that really holistically meet like the needs of like wellness first activations and just opportunities for people to explore these less boundaried lifestyles as well. I think that is a real crucial need for Gen Z at the moment. And this emotional comfort of having humor and like softness as part of what you're doing in the market. And finally, as a final point, in China's luxury market, leading brands really cultivate an aspirational crowd that buys into that lifestyle. So it's about building something that people really look up to. And it's not just about the product, but also kind of identifying where your brand might have aspirational elements that could build the community. And also just recognizing where your brand already lives within China and whereabouts in different Gen Z cultures, like there are already authentic connections to your brand. And I think finding communities can also be aspirational within China. So it's basically about recognizing where these communities already exist and building authentic connections. And that can mean lifestyle driven ecosystems like clubhouses, social rides, merchandise, inclusive pop-ups. Yeah, I think it's just about finding where Gen Zers are already kind of seen and they can bond, and that can be an aspirational space to create a place where people want to be, and not just about aspiring to be like what Jennie from Blackpink is wearing. But yeah, I think that's in a really quick roundup of what our report is about. But if you'd like to learn more about Gen Z consumer behaviours in China, we will be emailing everyone who attends the conference as well. But you're welcome to also email editorial@jingdaily.com for more information.